Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
The 2024 Indigenous Media Conference, organized by Indigenous Journalists Association, took place from July 25 to 27 in Oklahoma City, United States. The event brought together Indigenous journalists, media professionals, and experts from around the world to discuss and address the pressing issues faced by Indigenous media practitioners. The conference also provided an opportunity to celebrate their contributions and achievements. Cultural Survival was also present at this landmark event and asked Indigenous journalists to share their experiences, challenges, and successes in covering Indigenous communities and their efforts in collaborating for Indigenous rights.
My name is Angel Ellis, and I am a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation. I serve the IJA Executive Board Committee. We have started a press freedom committee that I'm chairing right now. We currently have around 63 tribal nations who have media organizations who are members of the Indigenous Journalists Association. And right now there's a handful of those tribes who have press freedom protected by code or by constitution. Our Press Freedom Committee is focused on providing resources to those Indigenous journalists of the Indigenous Journalists Association, and we're also focused on helping provide resources to the tribes who would like to explore press freedom and the citizens of those tribes who want to have press freedom conversations in their communities. A lot of the Indigenous peoples are living in the situations where they have to defend land or water and the rights of Indigenous people. So the journalists who are covering those topics are more likely to experience police violence and, government controls, and they're more likely to have their press freedom suppressed. And that's just probably because, the Indigenous community is often marginalized and targeted by police powers, and because they're by nature are living in close contact with their resources and defending those rights. So the Indigenous journalist becomes more susceptible to police violence, and they're more susceptible to experience, negative situations with law enforcement. They're more likely to experience violence from the public too when they're out there serving and collecting stories. Some of my panel friends were talking about the Canadian policy, and I can kind of talk to the United States policy. We're seeing press freedoms being eroded by law, and more journalists in both of these countries are being targeted by law enforcement. They're being charged with conspiracy, and they're really using these court systems to attack the reputation of journalists. And this trend is diminishing the credibility of journalism across the board, and that's been a long-standing operating method for lawmakers now. Is there if we discredit the journalist, then we don't have to worry about journalists holding us accountable as a government. Is kind of the thing that they're doing. Many of those organizations that want to protect press freedom are doing a lot of great work providing resources to the journalists who encounter violence, who are charged, in criminal cases for just doing journalism. They support the journalists. They provide legal counsel for the journalists. And another thing that they're doing that's really helpful is these organizations are helping to elevate the conversation and provide more information on the story to refute the facts that journalists are criminals. So these press freedom organizations are trying to help the journalists, show that they're just doing their jobs and they're just doing and working within their rights, and they do an important job of educating the public in that way, and they do an important job of providing resources to those journalists who have been targeted. A lot of times some of our Indigenous journalists are charged with conspiracy when they're covering protests, when the Native population is trying to defend their lands or their water rights, or even when the journalists are just trying to communicate to the general public about their tribal governments. We've seen journalists stories be censored, and sometimes the journalists are detained and intimidated. So those are the kinds of ways that these powers are trying to control the narratives and stop information from getting to regular citizens. I think that all Indigenous journalists need to pay extra close attention and know their rights and know the law. They also need to be very careful and have a plan in place. We need to think it's not if we're arrested, but when we're arrested, and we need to plan for that event very, specifically. We need to have the phone number of the person we're going to call if we're arrested. We need to have a plan in action, an action plan, so that if we're in custody, we have somebody there who's helping us and can communicate with people who are going to get the story out. We need to make sure that our stories do get published, because that's a thing that they do. When they arrest you, they're trying to prevent the story from being published. So the important thing for this journalist is to protect themselves, know their rights, and to keep publishing their stories and not become intimidated by these powers, because that's the whole plan, is to censor media in general. And if we're intimidated, then we're not doing the news and people aren't getting their information. I think that it's a really weird time that we're living in terms of journalism being attacked, and it's very important that we continue to educate ourselves on these changing policies. And I want to encourage all journalists, whether they're Indigenous or not, to plug into networks of support. Having support both emotionally and resource-wise can make a big difference in how we are successful in our roles.
For more information on Indigenous rights, visit ces.org/rights, and also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook.